At 8:01, the sound of a single click ended everything she had built. Years of loyalty, dedication, and long nights were erased by the mechanical cadence of a corporate voice reading from a script. The dismissal wasn't personal, at least not in tone. But she knew better. This wasn't a random cut. It was a calculated strike. Someone wanted her gone. Someone who smiled at her in meetings, borrowed her ideas under the pretense of collaboration, and now had maneuvered her out of the way with surgical precision. She let the silence settle after the call, her fingers resting lightly on the chaudi, untouched mug of coffee beside her. It was still warm, still real, while the voice that had gutted her career had already hung up. She didn't weep. She didn't slam her desk or storm out of the building. Instead, she stared at that coffee and understood that betrayal, when properly dissected, was not an end but an invitation, a challenge. And before we go further, if you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what comes next. Her rival's smile, always too polished, too rehearsed, was suddenly easy to decipher. The polite condolence of budget cuts wasn't kindness. It was a knife, slipped in smoothly between the ribs of trust, twisted with practiced elegance. She had seen enough in boardrooms to know what ambition looked like when it stalked prey. And this was ambition dressed as necessity. They thought she would fade quietly, that her silence would serve as consent. But silence has its own weight. As she packed her things, the quiet around her desk was louder than anything spoken in that meeting. Colleagues kept their distance, some pretending to type, others casting fleeting, guilty glances. She noticed all of it, the shift in posture, the small relief on some faces that it wasn't them, the tension of others who knew she deserved better. Every detail imprinted itself into her memory. The untouched coffee remained, a testament to an ending she refused to accept as final. Beneath her calm, the fire was already alive. It didn't flare out of control. It smoldered, controlled and deliberate. She burned, but not with desperation. She burned with calculation. Every betrayal left behind traces, emails, decisions, signatures that tied ambition to arrogance. Her rival believed the stage had been cleared, but she knew where the cracks ran in the foundation of that empire. She had spent years building it after all. No one understood its weaknesses better than she did. She knew where the shovel was buried. Not just one shovel, dozens. Files left forgotten, missteps hidden under layers of pretense, connections that her rival had cultivated recklessly in their rush to climb higher. Every weakness was a tool waiting to be unearthed. They thought the damage was complete, but she had been given something far more powerful than a position: freedom. With no chains binding her to appearances or diplomacy, she could operate in shadows, methodical and unseen. By the time the clock struck 9, the cracks had already begun to show. She had set the first domino into motion, a quiet nudge no one would trace back to her. A subtle reminder to a regulator of an overlooked detail. A forwarded message slipped to the right inbox. A whisper delivered through someone who owed her a favor. Small moves, precise and deliberate, but devastating in their effect. Her rival, seated in their glass-walled office, still smiled with the arrogance of someone who thought victory was permanent. But already, the empire they had clawed together was beginning to fracture. She didn't need to rush, because revenge, like any masterpiece, demanded patience. And as the hour turned, she allowed herself the faintest of smiles, because she wasn't just taking back what was stolen, she was ensuring they would lose everything they had betrayed her for. Her calm steps out of the office building that day were not of someone defeated, but of a strategist leaving the first battlefield, already plotting the war to come. The enemy thought they had buried her, but she was the one holding the shovel. She rose quietly, never the loudest voice in the room, never the one demanding attention. Instead, she built her strength in the shadows, earning the trust of powerful clients who noticed her precision, her calm solutions, and her unshakable reliability. While others postured and performed, she simply delivered. Slowly, the company's most important accounts began to treat her not as an assistant or a cog, but as the very backbone that kept their partnerships alive. She didn't boast about it. She didn't need to. Influence, when earned through results, speaks louder than titles ever could. And yet, with every quiet success, a shadow of resentment grew. The executive above her, polished, smug, and endlessly insecure, saw her rising, trust as a threat. On the surface, he praised her in meetings, presenting himself as the generous mentor who had shaped her potential. But behind that smile was fear, sharp and restless. He knew she was becoming something he could never control, indispensable. And insecurity, when coupled with ambition, is far more dangerous than open rivalry. The whispers began long before she ever heard them. Behind closed doors, alliances formed over late-night drinks and hushed strategy calls. Colleagues who once nodded at her with warmth started speaking in half-sentences and rehearsed smiles. She caught fragments, mentions of real leadership and company vision, always circling back to her name, always coated in a layer of envy. She pretended not to notice. The best predators let their prey believe they are unseen. Meanwhile, she carried the company on her shoulders. Projects closed because of her diligence, partnerships deepened because of her tact, yet the applause was redirected at her rival. He collected praise in meetings, weaving her contributions into his own narrative, and the board nodded along. She didn't protest. Each stolen victory was filed quietly in her memory, another ledger entry in a book of debts she intended to balance one day. But masks eventually crack. Subtle slips began to appear in her rival's performance. A hint of desperation in his tone when clients asked for her directly. A tightening jaw when emails praised her insight more than his authority. Promises were made in back rooms, promises she was never meant to hear. Yet whispers have a way of traveling, and she pieced together the betrayal even as it was still forming. He wasn't content with stealing her credit. He wanted her gone. What he underestimated was loyalty, the kind she had built not through fear or manipulation, but through quiet trust. While he schemed, she discovered allies in unexpected places. A colleague who admired her consistency, a client who relied on her judgment more than contracts, people who owed her not because she demanded it, but because she had been there when they needed her. These silent supporters didn't broadcast their allegiance, but their loyalty was ironclad, invisible threads waiting to be pulled when the time was right. And while he thought he held all the cards, she had already been sowing seeds of independence. Unbeknownst to the boardroom, she had built relationships that extended beyond the company's walls. Her value wasn't confined to her desk or her title. It was woven into the trust of clients who had come to see her as irreplaceable. She didn't brag about it. She didn't even hint. But in her heart, she knew that her power was no longer tied to the company's success. It was tied to hers. The betrayal, when it finally arrived, wasn't hidden in shadows. It was delivered openly, packaged as restructuring and realignment, a firing dressed up in sterile words but dripping with personal ambition. He smiled as he delivered the news, savoring what he thought was a final blow. To him, it wasn't just business. It was theft. Theft of her loyalty, of her credit, of the very identity she had built inside those walls. But what he didn't know, what he could never have known, was that his victory was hollow. The company's largest client, the one he boasted about, securing, already saw her as the reason they stayed. To them, she wasn't a nameless employee. She was a friend, a confidant, the steady hand they trusted. And while he believed he had cut her off from power, he had instead severed himself from the one connection that truly mattered. The stage was set, not by him, but by her quiet strength. His downfall was no longer a matter of if, it was only a matter of when. He had always stolen in whispers, never in storms. The memories came back in fragments, small betrayals that once seemed insignificant. A presentation she had stayed up all night perfecting, only to hear his voice deliver it word for word. Meetings where her insights were rebranded as his strategic foresight, invitations to dinners with clients that mysteriously excluded her, even when she had done the work to win them. At the time, she brushed it aside, telling herself ambition was messy and credit often blurred. But now, with her career reduced to ashes in a single phone call, the ghosts of those moments rose with sharper edges. They had never been random. They had always been deliberate. The red flags that once seemed like coincidences revealed their true shape. Every slight, every quiet undermining had been part of a careful design. He hadn't just taken advantage of opportunities. He had orchestrated them, piece by piece, preparing the stage for this final betrayal. And she, too, focused on keeping the company thriving, had allowed it. Now she saw it clearly. Her firing was not sudden. It was the conclusion of a play he had written long before. But anger never touched her face. Composure was her weapon, sharper than fury could ever be. While others would rage, she thought. While others would crumble, she planned. Rage burns, fast and blinds the mind. Calm sharpens it. Her rival believed he had cornered her, but in truth, he had only narrowed the battlefield to one she knew best: strategy. Already, the outline of her counterattack formed in silence, precise and patient. The first tools were hidden in plain sight: emails, messages, contracts signed in his name but written with her effort, small traces he never thought to erase. Promises he made to clients, commitments she fulfilled, timelines that proved whose hand had built the empire he claimed as his own. Each document was a thread, and together they formed a net. He believed the past was buried under his polished speeches, but the paper trail spoke louder than performance. While she pieced her arsenal together, he was busy celebrating. In a private dinner with his chosen allies, he raised a glass to his visionary leadership. The room echoed with laughter, smug toasts, and hollow admiration. He thought himself untouchable, bathing in the illusion of victory. But arrogance is always loudest right before the fall. Every word he spoke, every smirk that curved his lips only deepened her resolve. He was blind to the storm already circling him. What he failed to understand was that her greatest strength wasn't locked in files or hidden in evidence. It was in the trust she had earned, the loyalty of a client who had seen her dedication firsthand, who knew the truth behind the polished lies. To them, she wasn't replaceable, and she wasn't invisible. She was the reason they stayed, the steady anchor that made the partnership possible. Trust, once earned, cannot be bought or faked. It endures when power shifts and masks fall. All it would take now was one call. One precise moment where silence would break into action and the balance of power would tilt beyond repair. She didn't need to expose him with drama or spectacle. She only needed to let the truth reach the right ears. The thought steadied her heartbeat. The plan was simple, elegant, impossible to trace back. And when she finally lifted her phone, calm as ever, she knew the empire he had stolen piece by piece was about to collapse with a single, undeniable move. The email arrived before the dust of her firing had even settled. Its tone was polished, its phrasing confident, but beneath the veneer of professionalism bled arrogance. He had written directly to their largest client, boasting of his streamlined leadership and how the company would now operate with greater efficiency without her. He framed her absence as an improvement, erasing years of loyalty with a single smug paragraph. But arrogance always leaves cracks, and in his rush to assert dominance, he exposed the very weakness she had been waiting for. She didn't allow anger to guide her fingers. Instead, she reached for her phone, her hand steady, her pulse measured. Timing mattered. and silence was her greatest ally. Moments after his email, she dialed the client with the same composure she had carried into every negotiation, every late-night problem solved on their behalf. The call wasn't made in desperation. It was made in precision, the kind of move that wins wars, before the first shot is fired. The client answered quickly, their voice carrying surprise but not confusion. "We've been expecting your call," they said, their words lined with quiet certainty. And in that moment, the truth surfaced like a tide she had always known was there. Their trust had never rested in the company, nor in the pompous man who now claimed control. Their loyalty was hers. It had always been hers. As the conversation unfolded, years of restrained frustrations poured out from the client's side. They spoke of arrogance in the boardroom, empty promises and proposals, and the suffocating attitude that draped over every deal not handled by her. They admitted they had endured it only because she was there, smoothing the edges, ensuring integrity, where the company faltered. Without her, the mask slipped too easily, revealing the disdain they had long grown weary of. She listened, never interrupting, never pushing. When the time was right, she spoke with measured clarity. She did not offer revenge, nor did she beg for their faith. She painted a vision, clean, precise, a future where their partnership could flourish outside the shadow of a company that had grown drunk on its own arrogance. A path where results, not politics, defined success. The silence on the other end lasted only a breath before resolve answered. "We've been waiting for this," the client said firmly. "What they took for granted, we refuse to." The decision was immediate, fueled by years of quiet discontent, waiting only for this catalyst. Papers moved quickly, as though the universe itself had grown impatient with pretense. Contracts were drafted, signed, and sealed with a speed that mirrored her own resolve. Every clause was a cut, every signature a severing of ties, until the company's hold dissolved in ink. What had been theirs by arrogance was now hers by merit. By 8:45, less than an hour after her dismissal, the contract sat in her inbox. Her rival, still celebrating his illusion of triumph, had no idea the ground had already shifted beneath him. The empire he thought secured was bleeding from the center, undone not by fury, but by precision. And as she closed her laptop, calm and unshaken, she knew the lesson had been written in permanence. Power built on arrogance crumbles, but power built on trust endures. The announcement struck the company like a thunderclap. The client's departure was swift, public, and absolute, and the impact tore through the office walls with the force of betrayal. Whispers spread down corridors, emails flew in frantic threads, and meetings dissolved into arguments as panic replaced certainty. A single contract, one they had always assumed untouchable, was gone, and with it, the illusion of stability. What had once been paraded as a triumph was now a glaring wound for everyone to see. Behind his polished desk, the architect of arrogance felt the ground tilt. His earlier smirk, carved in confidence, crumbled as he dialed furiously, desperate, to spin stories that no longer held weight. Excuses rolled from his tongue, but every call ended with clipped replies, empty promises met with growing distrust. The charm he had once wielded so carelessly turned brittle, breaking under the weight of his own deception. What he thought was, control was nothing more than glass shattering in his hands. And while chaos consumed the office, she moved in silence, untouched by their collapse. The contract that had been lost to them was already safe in her possession, signed and secured as her first victory outside the company's walls. There was no fanfare, no celebration, only quiet satisfaction as she built her foundation with the kind of precision that arrogance could never understand. Her revenge was not shouted into the air, but etched into the future. Calm, deliberate, and irreversible. Every step she took was calculated, her moves invisible to those still drowning in noise. There were no reckless strikes, no messy confrontations. Instead, her actions sliced cleanly, leaving no trace but devastation for the one who had underestimated her. Each decision cut deeper than anger ever could, dismantling his empire piece by piece until nothing remained but the hollow echo of what once was. It was then, too late to recover, that the antagonist understood. His ruin had not come from betrayal by others, but from the overconfidence he wore like armor. He had believed himself untouchable, blind to the fact that his downfall had been waiting in the shadows of his own mistakes. The arrogance that fueled him became the very fire that consumed him, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. And at the exact hour they had cast her aside, she stood in her own space, free, stronger, crowned not by applause, but by silence. She did not gloat, nor did she look back. Victory needed no declaration, no performance. It lived in the unshakable truth that she had risen where he had fallen, her power now untouchable, her future her own. And as the walls of her old prison burned behind her, she walked forward without hesitation, leaving them to choke on the smoke of their own ruin. The empire they had built on arrogance began to crumble the moment the client walked away. Revenues bled faster than they could patch the wound, investors grew restless, and rumors of collapse seeped into every boardroom corridor. What once looked untouchable now cracked under pressure, the polished facade peeling back to reveal a hollow core. Every whisper carried weight, every hesitation from partners widened the fracture, and the mighty walls they had boasted about began to collapse from within. At the center of it all stood the antagonist, stripped of the power that once made him, feared. His words, once commands, now sounded like desperate pleas. The boardroom that once bowed to his arrogance turned its back, leaving him exposed to the humiliation he had sown. The empire he had flaunted dissolved piece by piece, leaving him not as a leader, but as a cautionary tale, brought down not by enemies but by the pride that blinded him. While he scrambled to salvage scraps of control, the protagonist moved, with quiet precision. No longer shackled by chains of corporate loyalty, they built their path on their own terms. What was once a cage had burned down to ash, and in its place stood freedom, raw, unyielding, and empowering. Every choice they made now served their vision, not someone else's ego. Strength grew where limits had once been forced upon them. And soon, that strength became power greater than the company ever offered. Their independence became their crown, their reputation cemented not in survival, but in command. Clients who once looked to the company now turned to them, not out of pity, but out of respect. Betrayal had been the spark, but resilience forged the fire that carried them far beyond the shadow of what was lost. It was then that justice revealed its sharp edge. Every deception, every slight, every dismissal returned like a blade, cutting deep into the arrogance that had once seemed unbreakable. The antagonist, left to face the ruins of his own making, became the perfect reflection of what happens when pride blinds judgment. His destruction was not forced upon him. It was carved by his own hand, a mirror held too close to the face he once wore with pride. And in that silence, the protagonist stood unshaken, free not only from the company, but from every limit it had ever tried to impose. The irony was undeniable. What had been meant to destroy them had only forged their rise. They did not need to shout their victory. It was written in the ashes of an empire and the foundations of their new reign. They thought they fired me, they reflected with calm certainty. In reality, they just freed me to take everything they once held.